You are told that high-ranking schools provide superior education and better student outcomes. What if I told you that school rankings destroy learning? This sounds logical because prestigious schools appear successful with impressive statistics and results. But something's wrong when top-ranked students perform well on tests but cannot think. Most parents believe choosing highly ranked schools guarantees better education and future success. Why do graduates from top schools struggle with independent thinking despite achievements? School rankings appear valuable because they provide measurable comparison between different educational institutions. But what if ranking systems optimize for metrics rather than actual learning? Think about the smartest person you know from a prestigious school recently. Can they solve problems creatively or just follow established procedures effectively? The ranking trap operates by convincing families that test scores equal educational quality. If you want to understand why ranked schools create test takers instead of thinkers, subscribe to Prof. Jung Explain and share this with parents obsessed with rankings. They need to see why prestigious schools often produce conformist graduates. The system creates different relationships with learning depending on your ranking focus approach. When we say educational excellence, we mean different outcomes based on testing versus thinking. For ranking-focused schools, educational success means achieving high standardized test scores consistently. They optimize curriculum for measurable outcomes rather than developing critical thinking skills. They measure progress through statistical performance rather than student intellectual development over time. For learning-focused schools, educational success means developing independent thinking and problem-solving abilities. They prioritize understanding concepts rather than memorizing correct answers for examinations. They measure progress through creative application rather than standardized testing performance metrics. Think about whether your education emphasized understanding concepts or memorizing correct answers. Consider the difference between learning to think versus learning to perform well. This explains how different educational approaches affect long-term intellectual development and capability. The difference isn't about academic rigor versus relaxation, but measurement versus development. But here's where it gets interesting about ranking systems and educational optimization mechanisms. The trap doesn't just focus on test scores instead of learning outcomes. It actually prevents schools from developing programs that create independent thinkers effectively. When schools optimize for rankings, they eliminate activities that don't improve scores. This creates what educators call curriculum narrowing, where creative subjects get reduced. Meanwhile, learning-focused schools maintain diverse programs that develop various intellectual capabilities. Consider how your school's curriculum changed when rankings became more important. Did creative programs expand or contract during ranking pressure periods? The ranking trap becomes sophisticated when examining how it handles teaching methodologies completely. Ranking-focused education typically emphasizes memorization rather than critical thinking skill development. This methodology prevents students from learning how to evaluate information independently. The memorization focus creates what psychologists call surface learning, rather than deep understanding. Students learn to reproduce information rather than analyzing concepts critically and independently. Meanwhile, learning-focused education develops analytical skills through questioning rather than accepting. Do you find yourself questioning information or accepting what authorities tell you? What happens when you encounter problems without predetermined solutions to memorize? The ranking trap exploits what behavioral economists call metric optimization in educational goal setting. Schools focus on improving measurable outcomes rather than developing unmeasurable intellectual capabilities. More ranking pressure creates more teaching to test rather than teaching thinking. This optimization prevents schools from recognizing that test performance doesn't correlate with abilities. Choosing ranking improvements over intellectual development often produces graduates who perform. Meanwhile, learning-focused schools understand that thinking skills matter more than scores. The ranking trap creates what educators call teaching to test, where instruction serves. Teachers focus on test preparation rather than developing student understanding of subjects. This preparation prevents genuine learning by replacing exploration with memorization techniques. Test preparation also prevents teachers from adapting instruction to individual student learning needs. Meanwhile, learning-focused teachers can adjust methods based on student understanding rather than performance. They can develop thinking rather than just improving test scores. The ranking trap creates competitive pressure where students compete rather than collaborate effectively. Ranking systems pit students against each other rather than encouraging cooperation, learning. This competition prevents collaborative problem solving that develops critical thinking through discussion. Competition becomes problematic when students hide knowledge rather than sharing insights with others. They optimize individual performance rather than collective understanding and learning progress. Meanwhile, learning-focused environments encourage collaboration that enhances everyone's intellectual development through sharing. But something more sophisticated happens with ranking systems and parental decision-making and choices. The trap doesn't just focus schools on test scores instead of development. It convinces parents that rankings represent educational quality when they often opposite. Parents choose schools based on statistical performance rather than educational philosophy or methodology. This choice creates market pressure for schools to optimize rankings rather than outcomes. The pressure also prevents schools from implementing innovative approaches that don't scores. Meanwhile, informed parents can recognize that rankings often indicate test preparation rather than education. They can evaluate schools based on learning outcomes rather than statistical performance. The ranking trap handles what psychologists call cognitive narrowing in intellectual development patterns. Students learn to think within predetermined frameworks rather than developing independent analytical capabilities. This narrowing prevents creative problem solving that requires thinking outside established parameters. Narrow thinking also prevents students from questioning assumptions or developing original approaches to. Meanwhile, learning-focused education encourages students to question everything and develop perspectives. They can think independently rather than following prescribed thinking patterns. The ranking trap also exploits what sociologists call status signaling in educational choice-making. Parents choose highly ranked schools to signal social status rather than educational quality. This signaling prevents evaluation of whether schools actually develop student intellectual capabilities. Status focus also prevents parents from recognizing that prestigious schools often produce students. Meanwhile, parents focus on learning can choose schools that develop thinking rather than they can prioritize intellectual development over social signaling through school choice. But there's something even more sophisticated happening with ranking systems and intellectual development. The trap doesn't just optimize for test performance instead of critical thinking. It creates systematic intellectual conformity by rewarding predetermined answers rather than thinking. Students learn that success comes from providing expected responses rather than original analysis. This conformity prevents intellectual independence that requires challenging established ideas and assumptions effectively. The system also punishes creative thinking that doesn't match predetermined correct answers. Meanwhile, learning-focused environments reward original thinking and intellectual risk-taking through encouragement. They can develop independent thinkers rather than conformist test takers through methodology. The ranking trap addresses what economists call perverse incentives in educational system design. Schools receive rewards for improving rankings rather than developing student intellectual capabilities. These incentives prevent schools from focusing on learning outcomes that matter for success. Perverse rewards also create what educators call teaching distortion, where instruction serves metrics. Meanwhile, learning-focused schools can maintain educational integrity by focusing on development. They can resist perverse incentives by prioritizing learning over ranking improvements. The ranking trap also exploits what psychologists call authority dependence in student intellectual development. Students learn to rely on teachers for correct answers rather than developing judgment. This dependence prevents intellectual confidence necessary for independent thinking and analysis. Authority reliance also prevents students from learning to evaluate information sources and credibility. Meanwhile, learning-focused education develops intellectual independence through questioning and critical evaluation. Students can develop judgment rather than just following authority figures consistently. But perhaps most insidious involves how ranking systems affect creativity and innovation. Students from highly ranked schools often struggle with open-ended problems without answers. This struggle reveals that ranking systems optimize for conformity rather than development. Ranking also creates what educators call solution dependency, where students need guidance. Students become unable to approach problems without predetermined methods or established solutions. Meanwhile, learning-focused education develops problem-solving confidence through practice with ambiguous challenges. The ranking trap creates intellectual fragility, where students cannot handle uncertainty or complexity. Ranking-focused students need clear instructions and predetermined answers to function academically effectively. This fragility prevents adaptation to real-world problems that don't have answers. Meanwhile, learning-focused students develop intellectual resilience through exposure to challenging problems. They can handle uncertainty and complexity because they learn to think independently. The ranking trap works by providing statistical satisfaction while preventing intellectual development completely. It allows parents to feel they chose excellent education while students develop performance rather than thinking abilities that matter for success. Students experience academic achievement satisfaction while losing intellectual independence necessary for innovation. Meanwhile, actual education requires developing thinking skills rather than optimizing test performance. The trap perpetuates because ranking-focused students who succeed often had natural intellectual advantages. They become advocates for ranked schools while overlooking intellectual limitations that ranking creates. The successful examples obscure students who develop better thinking through approaches. And remarkably, the ranking trap has convinced people that test scores equal intelligence. When examining intellectual development reveals that independent thinking often matters more than performance. Ranking-focused students need thinking development rather than just score optimization. The ranking trap represents effective mechanisms for converting educational energy into performance. Rather, it transforms learning into test preparation without requiring intellectual development or thinking. Understanding this trap doesn't mean avoiding academic achievement, but recognizing intellectual development priorities. It means choosing education that develops thinking while maintaining reasonable academic standards. If you want analysis of how educational systems create conformity rather than thinkers, subscribe to Prof. Jiang Explained. Share this with someone obsessed with school rankings and test scores. They need understanding why prestigious education often produces intellectual conformity rather than innovation. The ranking trap also creates what economists call signaling distortion in educational choice patterns. Parents focus on school prestige rather than educational outcomes when making decisions. This signaling prevents recognition that high rankings often indicate test preparation rather than development. Prestige focus also prevents parents from evaluating whether schools actually develop intellectual capabilities. Consider how your parents chose your school based on reputation versus educational philosophy. Did they prioritize rankings or actual learning when making educational decisions for you? The ranking trap exploits what psychologists call outcome substitution in educational evaluation processes. Parents measure educational quality through test scores rather than intellectual development capabilities. This substitution prevents recognition that scores don't correlate with thinking abilities necessarily. Measurement confusion also prevents parents from understanding what educational success actually means practically. The ranking trap creates what educators call curriculum distortion, where subjects get eliminated systematically. Schools reduce art, music, philosophy, and creative writing to focus on subjects. This distortion prevents well-rounded education that develops various intellectual capabilities through exposure. Subject elimination also prevents students from discovering natural talents and interests outside areas. But there's something even more sophisticated about ranking systems and intellectual development limitation. The trap doesn't just narrow curriculum to focus on testable subjects exclusively. It creates systematic intellectual dependency by teaching students to seek predetermined answers. Students learn that intellectual success means finding correct responses rather than developing thinking. This dependency prevents intellectual confidence necessary for innovation and original problem solving completely. The system also discourages questioning that might lead to non-standard answers. Meanwhile, learning-focused education encourages intellectual independence through open-ended exploration and questioning. Students can develop confidence in their thinking rather than seeking authority validation. The ranking trap handles what behavioral scientists call cognitive rigidity in intellectual development patterns. Students learn to apply predetermined methods rather than developing flexible thinking approaches. This rigidity prevents adaptation to novel problems that require creative solutions. Rigid thinking also prevents students from synthesizing information from multiple sources independently. Meanwhile, flexible education develops intellectual adaptability through exposure to diverse problems. Students can approach challenges creatively rather than following prescribed methods consistently. The ranking trap also exploits what sociologists call competitive individualism in educational environments completely. Students compete against classmates rather than collaborating to solve problems together effectively. This competition prevents collective learning that enhances individual intellectual development through discussion. Individual competition also creates knowledge hoarding where students hide insights from others. But perhaps most devastating involves how ranking systems affect intellectual curiosity and motivation. The ranking trap also creates what economists call metric gaming in educational institutions. But there's something more sophisticated about how ranking systems affect teacher behavior patterns. The ranking trap also exploits what educators call teaching standardization in instructional methodology approaches. But perhaps the most insidious aspect involves how ranking systems affect intellectual development. Students learn to avoid intellectual risks that might result in incorrect answers. This avoidance prevents intellectual growth that requires experimenting with ideas and approaches. Risk aversion also prevents students from developing resilience necessary for intellectual challenges later. Meanwhile, learning-focused education encourages intellectual risk-taking through supportive environments that mistakes. Students can experiment with ideas rather than avoiding intellectual challenges completely. Understanding this trap doesn't mean avoiding academic achievement, but recognizing intellectual development priorities. It means choosing education that develops thinking while maintaining reasonable academic standards. If you want analysis of how educational systems create conformity rather than thinkers, subscribe to Prof. Jiang Explained. Share this with someone obsessed with school rankings and test scores.